And welcome to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your purveyor here at Whiskey Politics. Find me at davesussman.com, the independent.io range broadcasting network, and all of your favorite podcasting applications, and YouTube. Please subscribe. You can also find us at ricochet.com. We've got a two-for you today. First, the judge returns with some serious firepower. Judge Jeanine Pirro, in her latest book, Don't Lie to Me, discusses the New York shutdowns. She talks about the vote by mail debacle, talks about Spygate and the declassified documents, Comey, Brennan, Clinton, everything that just took place and what will be taking place moving out here. Will Durham have an impact on all of this? This was an interview that was actually filmed right before the vice presidential debate, so we didn't get to discuss that, but more than enough of the subjects, and I think you're going to enjoy that discussion. And then at the timestamp below, you will see where our second interview is with Jonathan Williams. Jonathan Williams is the chief economist and executive vice president of policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, otherwise known as ALEC. That's where these folks are working with policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop economic policy solutions for the states. And for 13 years, he has partnered with Dr. Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, both frequented our show before in the past, and they've created something called the Rich States, Poor States Economic Index. This is a really interesting model that they use, and you can find it for free at richstatespoorstates.org. And it really gives us an indication of the direction economically that states are moving in, which states are best to run a business and live. And I find it absolutely pertinent to the discussion right now with migration happening. People are leaving states like New York and California, heading to states like Nevada, Tennessee, Texas, Florida. And we get into the reasons why. And I find it's fascinating discussion from an economic standpoint, and I think you will find it as well. But before we bring both guests on, I just want to address the vice presidential debate. I was live broadcasting and then spoke for an hour and a half afterwards, more or less a monologue on this. And I just want to address two issues on the VP debate, because we're moving quickly into whether or not there's going to be a presidential debate. As of right now, the commission is talking about doing something virtual. Donald Trump has said no way. So I guess they're going to have to negotiate how that all works. But on the VP debate, a couple of things. Number one, Kamala Harris isn't answering the questions as Joe Biden didn't answer the questions regarding packing the court and SCOTUS, okay, and who their preferred nominees will be should they win the election for SCOTUS. They are dancing around this, and the media are generally not calling them out on this. And I spoke about this on the radio right after the debate, and here's the reason why. We know this. This is so transparent. You probably know this as well. For both Biden and Kamala Harris to answer that question, they lose the election. It's plain and simple math. They either answer truthfully, which is that they're going to stack the court with progressive, activist judges that are going to placate their leftist base. And they're going to put people on there which want to, in essence, demolish the Constitution, rip apart the protected freedoms that we have under the Constitution, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments regarding due process. And for them to do that, they are going to lose the moderate middle that they desperately, desperately need. Because this country, no matter how divided we are, is generally either just to the right or just to the left, the majority. Take the 10% on the extremes that we see on Twitter and in the media. Those are the extremes. Most people, as my friend Ken Emmons refers to, is the 80% majority, around the middle. They're not crazy left, they're not crazy right. And for Kamala and Biden to suggest for even a moment that they will be stacking the courts with activist judges, they will lose that moderate middle. Now, here's the funny thing. Donald Trump, during the 2016 election, he gave us who his nominees will be. He went down the list of the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, and he said people like Gorsuch and people like Kavanaugh and people like Amy Coney Barrett are the people that I will be nominating. And guess what? He won. because people don't want activist judges coming in and using the zeitgeist of the time to change laws that have been protected in this country for 250 years. Or if Biden and Harris decide that they're going to placate the middle and they're going to come out with originalist judges or non-crazy judges, they are going to lose their leftist base, the AOCs that want to demolish our Constitution. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. And the media are tiptoeing around this because they know this. Second issue regarding the VP debates, and then we're going to bring in Judge Jeanine. The issue that I'm seeing currently online right now is hashtag mansplaining. Holy cow. This is why the Biden campaign made it absolutely known that they were going to use identity politics to select their VP, that they want a woman of color, because by them allowing themselves to say that we are going to choose somebody based upon their race and their sex, that opened up all of the defense mechanisms that the left like to use, such as, well, you can't talk to a woman like that because that's sexist. Mansplaining is absolutely ridiculous. It is a meaningless, vapid, childish rejoinder that the left will now use continually when anybody wants to ask Kamala Harris a question. But what it does is it absolutely infantilizes, it makes a victim of women by suggesting that they shouldn't have to debate any man who has the audacity, the temerity to actually make points in a debate. This is an incredibly stupid time that we're living in. And for people like George Snuffleupagus to bring that up, mansplaining, is absolutely fitting in with the expectations of the Biden campaign and the left. This is why the Biden campaign telegraphed their decision early that they were going to select somebody based upon their plumbing and their color. Because how dare you, Mr. White Man, ask questions of a woman of color? But here's the good news. Most people saw Kamala Harris for who she was last night, a vapid, inauthentic weather vane that changes her policy based upon her audience and convenience. And you can't do that. There's something called the internet, and recording devices such as video equipment just months ago recorded her saying things along the lines of her first policy is to ban fracking. So people will see this for what it is. And the bad news for Kamala Harris and the campaign is that Kamala Harris is going to be a mere heartbeat away from the presidency. Nobody expects that a 78-year-old, which is, by the way, the average age of death, nobody expects a 78-year-old, the oldest president, starting his first term, will make it through. I'm sorry, that may sound awful, but between his mental acuity and his age, there's a very strong likelihood that Kamala Harris becomes president of the United States. This is a woman that did not receive one delegate in the primaries. She went out before, what's her name? Marianne Williamson. I mean, the audacity of the left to hoist this inauthentic Politico upon the United States. Very unlikable woman, smarmy and shifting and fake laughing. I'm telling you right now, she is dead weight for the Biden campaign. Absolute dead weight. And that is why they are hiding her. When was the last time she took a press conference and actually answered questions? Not questions that were selected by the campaign, but questions from actual real reporters. You don't see this because she is so unlikable, so smarmy, so smug, and most importantly, inauthentic. So that's my quick wrap up of the VP debate. I think it was an absolute win for the vice president and the Trump campaign. Now let's see what happens with the future debates. If they happen, what it looks like. Hopefully Trump can follow in the footsteps of what I thought was an outstanding performance by Vice President Pence. Now we're going to go to our recorded interview from a couple of days ago with Judge Jeanine Pirro, and then we'll go straight into, and you'll see again the timestamp below, Jonathan Williams over at ALEC. Thanks for joining us. You know Judge Jeanine Pirro as the host of Justice with Judge Jeanine on Fox News Channel. Previously, she hosted Judge Jeanine Pirro, a syndicated court show for which she won an Emmy in 1990. She was the first woman elected to sit on the Westchester County Court bench, and in 1993, she again made history as the first woman elected district attorney in Westchester County, New York. She's author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, and her latest, Don't Lie to Me and Stop Trying to Steal Our Freedom, is now available everywhere books are sold. Welcome back, Judge Jeanine. How are you?
I'm terrific. Thanks so much for having me on. I love the name of your show.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, first of all, I just want to address something with you, talking about Westchester County. Okay. It seems everyone is moving from New York City to Westchester County right now. You tweeted about Bill de Blasio, who is now shutting down New York City again. And you say that it's to scare New Yorkers from working, going to school, and to continue the gloom and doom of the DNC. You think that's their game plan?
Well, I can't imagine what else it is. I mean, what we do know is that, the locking everyone in a basement was pretty much a reason for the continuing spread of the virus. And it's really the hypocrisy and the lies. I mean, I can't believe now that they want to start locking down New York by zip code now. And the problem is that when people were protesting in the thousands for Black Lives Matter, with the movement, which is great, I have no problem, but the organization in the thousands, no mask, they were saying, have at it, this is your moment in history, go out there, make a difference. But you people who want to work, don't you dare go to work. You want to go to church? You can't go to church. Don't you dare go to a funeral. And, it's just this incredible hypocrisy where they're trying to scare us. And now this last minute vote by mail, because all of a sudden people can't go to the polls. Well, people have been going to Costco, Home Depot, Lowe's, since the pandemic. I mean, you just keep social distancing, you wear a mask, people know what to do. But in the end, I think the attempt by the left to keep us in our basements, to open the border, and then to defund the police, so again, we don't feel safe, and take away our guns is like the trifecta for them. They want to keep us down and bring in the Trojan horse, who's Joe Biden, and behind him are the Marxist, socialist, police-hating, gun-hating, American-hating. If you look at any of these protests, I mean, they protest with impunity. I mean, they can tear down a business and loot it on Main Street, on Fifth Avenue in New York, and police are not deployed in Democrat cities. The crime is going up. This isn't the America that Americans want.
Judge Jeanine, in your book, you discuss so many different things, the impeachment inquiry, the military, the road to 2020, and we are just less than a month now away from 2020, and we're seeing reports everywhere that the vote ballots that are being mailed out, for example, in Los Angeles alone, basically people are getting ballots. My mother, who lives in Los Angeles County, has gotten multiple ballots from people that lived in that home for the past 50 years. She's been there for 10, and we're seeing this across the country. How concerned are you about the legitimacy of the vote?
I am so concerned. I must tell you, every American needs to be concerned, because every vote needs to count, and that vote needs to count in the pale of votes that are legitimate. And, this last minute mail-in voting where people are getting ballots in the names of their dogs, people are getting ballots in the names of dead people, which is, Obama was not purging the voter registration rolls. You remember that. And he had to be sued in some states to do that. And then when President Trump came in, he assigned, I believe it was Chris Kobach, and they were going to clean all the dead people out of the voter registration list. And the secretaries of state who were Democrats refused to give them the list, thinking that they're simply trying to, get information on everyone. Some crazy reason. And so dead people will be voting, illegal people who are not citizens will be voting. Fraudsters will be voting. People will steal your identity and vote in your name. We'll have motor voter registration. They'll go vote and register to vote at the same time. This is teed up for disaster. And the worst part is that there are judges in this country who are saying you don't have to count the votes or the ballots in your state until a week after the election. What do you think is going to go on from election night to a week after the election? If you think those protests were bad, that were peaceful protests, and don't believe your lying eyes, this is going to be, Armageddon.
You're not quite old enough to remember 2000, I'm sure, but we went through 6 weeks, and it was that one state regarding specifically one county. What does November the 4th plus look like this year?
I can't imagine, and I'm afraid to think what it looks like. I mean, my fear is really that, people will be unsure, the market will be unsure. People will be protesting. They're going to find ballots. I mean, think about the election in Florida. I believe it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, when Ron DeSantis was elected as governor. I mean, the Secretary of State down there was coming up with that. They found like boxes of ballots and pickup trucks, and the corruption and the ability to harvest is a very, very dangerous situation.
Mm. All right, moving on to another subject. So we got you for a short period here.
I got to open the gate. Hold on 1 second. We've got, because that'll keep ringing until I open it.
We're in the home of Judge Jeanine, folks.
Because I'm doing Fox tonight. I am so sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It's actually kind of cool to see, you're in your home, and because we always see you on the set. So, okay, in the last week, the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, he is the director over there. He declassified information to the effect that the U.S. intelligence agencies obtained insight into Russian intelligence analysis, alleging that U.S. presidential candidate Hillary Clinton had approved a campaign plan to stir up a scandal against the presidential candidate, Donald Trump, by tying him to Putin and the Russians. We know this. You've talked about it on your show. But Ratcliffe also indicated at the time that Brennan, CIA director, he briefed President Obama and others on the intelligence. And this week, today, as we're filming it, he has declassified information, which is really hard to see. Most of it was not redacted, that essentially stated that there were handwritten notes by John Brennan, all saying, essentially, this is what happened. Okay. We know the hypocrisy with the media, that if this was the shoe was on the other foot and it was a Democrat, this will be front page headlines. We're not seeing this anywhere in the mainstream media. Does this have legs and impact our election?
When the mainstream media doesn't cover it, only the people who watch Fox will hear about it. And, they are so tired of what went on with the Russia collusion, delusion, that they still think that, the president is a Putin puppet. But, every day, every week, we find out more information that just is further affirmation of what we suspected in the beginning. I mean, I talked about this in my first book, Liars, Leakers, and Liberals, and then Radicals Resistance. I said Obama was in on it. In my first book, I said John Brennan is the king of the swamp. He is swamp scum. All right. And everybody would say, no, that's not true. That's not true. The ability or the intent to take down a president of the United States, it's like a third world country. And they said, and when the president came out, when President Trump came out and said they were spying on me and they're wiretapping me, everybody went, oh boy, Trump is crazy. Well, I guess he was right, wasn't he? And then when James Comey was asked, were you spying against the president? He said, I don't even know what spy means. What does that mean? And the lies of the left they make me crazy, which is why I wrote, don't lie to me. Yeah. And stop trying to steal our freedom. Stop trying to steal elections. Stop trying, they're either complicit with the FISA court, or the FISA court was too dumb to know what was going on. But I think because of the emails, and if we put everything together, you see that they're talking about getting a friendly judge under the cover of a dinner party. And they get their warrant, and Carter Page was spied on. He was the vehicle that they used to spy on Donald Trump. It's disgusting. It's a third world country kind of op. It's disgusting. And if we don't see any kind of prosecution, people will lose faith in the system. I will lose faith in the system. I mean, I was a part of the system for 32 years as a prosecutor, a judge, and a DA. I ran for office 5 times for those offices. You know, I have a lot of sweat equity in the truthfulness of the system. And to see what they were doing is repulsive. It's absolutely repulsive.
Okay, so a lot of people are suggesting Durham report or whatever indictments don't come out now before the election because it's too close to the election. What do you think happens after?
Well, you know, I don't know. I wish I could be a fly on the wall in any of those meetings, but, you know, I think Durham has had enough time. I get that this is an investigation that affects people around the world. I totally get that. But I also believe that you know, justice has to be swift and as well as certain. And it's time. It is time that justice be had in this country. And it's not just Comey and Strzok and McCabe and Joe Biden sitting in there with the Logan Act recommending it in the Oval Office on January 5th. Let's talk about the fact that Joe Biden's son, this man's running for president of the United States. Yeah. His son's going through Europe with a vacuum cleaner, sucking up money from Ukraine, Eastern Europe, $3.5 million from the wife of the mayor of Moscow, $1.5 billion from China, and Joe Biden's brother building houses in Saudi Arabia with government contracts. This is a crime family, and this guy's running for president of the United States, and nobody's asking any questions. They just say, oh, it's been debunked. The same with Hillary Clinton. That 501c3 operating as a charitable foundation was nothing more than an organized criminal enterprise. Yeah. Enough of this. You know, I get very, very disappointed when I think about what has gone on. And it all started with Jeff Sessions and his refusal to start prosecuting these cases and recusing himself.
In our last minute here, greatly appreciate you taking the time. Tell us a little bit about Don't Lie to Me and Stop Trying to Steal Our Freedom, your latest book.
Well, you know, Don't Lie to Me is the third in the trilogy of Liars, Leakers, Liberals, Radicals, Resistance, and it is literally up to the minute. And you know, my publisher was pulling the manuscript from me because every day, every 24 hours, Donald Trump is making news, and it's about the pandemic, the lies of the pandemic. I talk about the people who created the models for the pandemic. They were losers. Especially this guy, Neil Ferguson from the UK, who convinced everyone with mad cow disease, kill your cows, kill your sheep, and he was wrong. And then I go into the protest and what the genesis of the protests are, what the purpose is. And there's loads of footnotes. So if you're fighting with a liberal or a leftist, you've got all the facts behind you there. But in the end, I want Americans to understand that they've been lied to. And this Trojan horse with Kamala Harris talking about the Harris administration, Joe Biden talking about the Harris administration, sometimes you need to believe people when they tell you who they are.
Absolutely. Judge Jeanine Pirro, everybody check her out at Fox News with her show and her latest book, Don't Lie to Me and Stop Trying to Steal Our Freedom. Thank you so much, Judge. We'll look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks so much. It was great being with you. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Dr. Art Laffer, Stephen Moore, and Jonathan Williams are the authors of the Rich States, Poor States, ALEC Laffer State Economic Competitiveness Index. It's a comprehensive report that ranks the economic competitiveness of states, which is used by state lawmakers across America to make critical policy decisions that protect hardworking taxpayers. We've had the good fortune of having both Dr. Art Laffer and Stephen Moore on the show multiple times. Stephen just returned, in fact, last month, but I'm delighted to welcome for the first time Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is the Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, that is ALEC, where he works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop economic policy solutions for the states. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Financial Times, the Toronto Star, the Australian, and Investors Business Daily, and he is also a contributor for The Hill. He's also a frequent guest on talk radio shows and has appeared on numerous television outlets, including PBS NewsHour, Fox Business News, and Bloomberg. Welcome to the show, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing great, Dave, and just thanks for having me. It's great to be with you, and as always, greetings from the land of make-believe here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, so it's fascinating to me that you guys are in DC. You're working with these incredible minds like yourself, Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, whose ideas and philosophy and thoughts have definitely been impactful on policies that are not just from a federal standpoint, but across the states. Tell us a little bit about what you guys have put together with the Rich States, Poor States Index.
Well, sure. It's been a great project to work on now for 13 years running. And my first week at ALEC coming on board, I was given the opportunity to take this project and really run with it with the great Art Laffer and Steve Moore. And we wanted to come up with a product that we could use with our core membership at ALEC. And we are a free market, nonpartisan, nonprofit group of state legislators who voluntarily join to get the educational resources to help them be better lawmakers in their 50 state capitals. And so we wanted to give them a resource and really a way to measure their states accurately with nonpartisan data to show how competitive their economies were and what they needed to do to become even more competitive. Because we all know, states are competing against each other all the time for job creation and business locations and lots of different things that just are the metrics of economic prosperity. We know that we have these 50 laboratories of democracy, and that's why we wanted to put together this report, is give state legislators as well as their constituents and concerned taxpayers around the country an accurate and timely way to measure how competitive their states are.
Tell us a little bit about the philosophy behind ALEC before we get into, obviously, the states and the breaking everything down that you guys have found out here. Where do you guys come from politically, philosophically?
Well, we've been around for about 50 years now, and there was a small group of state legislators that got together in that conservative bastion of Chicago, Illinois, back in the early 1970s, to say we need a free market group of state legislators that think about limited government and free markets and federalism as their guideposts and principles as an organization, and come up with best practices. Because we realize that what works in Texas doesn't necessarily always work in Montana, or what works in Maine doesn't necessarily always work in Arizona, but there's some common principles revolving around freedom and revolving around federalism that states ought to be able to learn from each other and come up with model ideas that do have a lot of overlap in different states and how they govern. And so our philosophy, while not partisan, is very rooted in some, I think, very American principles, quintessential principles our founders believed in, such as, first of all, you mentioned, us being in Washington, D.C., we realize first and foremost that not all good ideas, in fact, most good ideas shouldn't and don't come from Washington, D.C. They actually come from the states and local units of government and the people of the states. And that's a core principle of ALEC, because we believe in state solutions and giving states autonomy in order to have this competition among states, which is good for free markets and it's good for people. Because, as I always say, Dave, when states compete for taxpayers or for jobs or for anything else, who wins? It's people that win.
It's fascinating to me, and everything that you guys are talking about on your site, richstatespoorstates.org, by the way, and we'll have it in the Chiron here for folks to find you. There's some fascinating findings in all of this, but I guess the index that you guys have put together, which ranks the states from, you call it worst to best, what are those parameters? You're looking for economic growth, competition. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, in the Rich States, Poor States report, we look at states a couple of different ways. And I think the most instructive of the ways that we measure states is what we call our economic outlook ranking. And what that is based on 15 equally weighted criteria that are based in current policies in those states. Because at the end of the day, we want this to be an index that really helps state lawmakers as they're thinking through their policy environment and what they can do to become more competitive as states. And so we chose these 15, and obviously you could choose probably 1,000 different variables of what matters for states being successful in some cases and not in others. But when Art Laffer came to us with this metric system that he has now developed for over 50 years, with Laffer Associates when he worked with President Reagan, and back in California, even before that with Governor Reagan. He's been studying the states, and we chose these 15 variables such as taxes and regulations and labor policy because of really two big reasons. One is we know based on his decades of research that all of these variables directly impact and significantly in many cases impact the trajectory and the growth of states, one state versus another. And then probably just as importantly, from a practical standpoint, and this is where we see so many of these indices, it's almost a proliferation of different groups that are coming out with how to rank the states these days because they know it gets a lot of attention in the media for right reasons, because people want to compare themselves versus their neighbors and states all across the country. But just as importantly as the variables mattering for growth is that they're variables that state policymakers in Sacramento, California, to Lansing, Michigan, my home state, to Richmond, Virginia, always control these variables. They're things that on a given year, when they come into their legislative session, they can change the levers of policy to make themselves better or make themselves less competitive. It's all up to them. And that's the beauty of this system that we have with 50 laboratories of democracy.
You know, it's really interesting when you take a look at the results of these this gauge, and you know, we see. I think for a lot of people that follow the economy, I'm a lay economist myself. We see the states that we would expect to be at the best and the worst. Those are relating to, as you refer to, the marginal tax rates, regulation, right to work, how much unions have control over their state. And I see, you know, you take a look at some of the worst states, they are the, the usual suspects: New York, California, Illinois, Oregon. These are the states right now, especially California and New York, where we are seeing a bloodletting of what I like to call the providers. Okay, the folks that are actually the doers, the business owners, the entrepreneurs. They are leaving in droves. Viewers of our show have heard me complain about this for the past several months. I am now at 9 friends of mine who have left the state of California for friendlier confines. Tennessee, Texas, Florida, Nevada. It just so happens in your state index, those are some of the strongest states. So are we seeing right now, talk to me a little bit about, I guess, the flight of capital and free markets are allowing people to make decisions. And I guess, does water find its own level, Jonathan?
It's a great question, and it's something that's been really at the heart of what we've tried to measure now for more than a decade. And, one of the interesting things that I think it points out is that, why our variables matter. You just mentioned some of the top and bottom states. And most people who follow even casually what's going on in the economy and business location decisions and where people are voting with their feet, as we like to say, and moving from one state to another, realize very quickly, based on those two very different philosophies of governance in those two groups of states, we know that the groups of states that value more economic freedom, more individual liberty, better business climates, lower regulation, reasonable regulation, those are the states that are gaining in population. And we are right at the precipice right now of the 2020 census, where at least once every decade, Dave, the members of Congress pay attention to what happens at the state level. It's because state lawmakers redraw their own congressional boundaries in the U.S. House based on reapportionment and redistricting, of course. And this is where states win or lose politically from this great phenomenon that we talk about of people voting with their feet. But of course, it goes way beyond the politics. Much more importantly, is people's livelihoods, it's the economy, it's the economic vitality of one state versus another. And you mentioned a couple of great examples. One, New York, a state that is now down more than 1 million people on net of Americans who have picked up and have left New York and gone to one of the other 49 states. You look at California, you mentioned California, down more than 800,000 Americans on net over the last decade. When you think about it, Silicon Valley, the beaches, the great mountains, it's all the amenities that California has, yet it's hemorrhaging people. It's clearly more than weather and other things that just are luck of why some states grow and some states don't. California is a case study in what not to do and how to really mess up a very otherwise a very prosperous state. That when Art Laffer was there and Ronald Reagan was governor, much different economic outlook in California than today, and it's decades worth of really poor policy decisions that have caused this outmigration. And it's no coincidence that you look at the top, let's say 10 or the bottom 10 in our economic outlook rankings, and almost to a state, you have huge outmigration in the states that are in the bottom of the index and huge in-migration in the states that are competitive, that are giving people a reason to go. And the number one reason, Paul, or to David, how they actually, why people move from one state to another is this. It's clear and it's very common sense. It's economic opportunity. That's why people move from one state to another. And that's why we see states like Texas and Florida, the states that you mentioned, no income tax states, states that keep the cost of government regulation and taxation lower. That's why we see those states continuing to succeed, not just this year, not just the past decade, but now over a course of many decades.
You know, I find it interesting that your number one strongest state, this last finding, was the state of Utah. We just had a vice presidential debate there last night. I've just been invited to a family member's home. They've moved to Park City from California. They are one of those that migrated out of California for friendlier confines, and Utah was the place that they chose. I think the worst, I guess the weakest, as you would refer to them, was New York, number 50. So if you are comparing just the states, obviously New York is a huge megapolis. Okay, there's tremendous amount of capital there. You have Wall Street, you have the mainstream media, and even upstate you've got industry. And then you compare that to a place like Utah, which really, quite frankly, Salt Lake City is a mid-sized city, and out of that, there's really not a lot in Utah, just some small towns. You're not talking about the economic power. You're not talking about the capital. You're just talking about, I guess, the freedom to move around and run your business, correct?
And I think that's an important distinction, as our economic outlook ranking looks at the overall competitiveness of that state's economy when it comes to the policies that it currently has in place in taxes and regulation and labor policy. How friendly is it for future economic growth and future business development? And how friendly is it for taxpayers in an individual sense? And so you're right, some states have started decades ahead, really, when you think of the Northeast and you think of New England being developed so much quicker than the rest of the country, and really having a huge industrial base for so long, and then having the financial sectors, insurance in Connecticut, for instance, and you have New York with Wall Street and the financial industry, huge built-in advantages. And yet, because of a lot of poor decisions over decades, now we've seen those states become out-migration states. In New York alone, my co-author Steve Moore suggests that you add bad policy now to the continuing lockdowns by the governors in many of these states because of the pandemic, and maybe their more aggressive approaches to lockdowns versus other governors. And then, of course, now you have the phenomenon of many firms saying you're going to allow workers to be remote. You're seeing even greater out-migration out of New York City, a very high cost of living city anyways, where Steve Moore estimates that 500,000 individuals have left New York City since the start of the pandemic alone. So adding to some very bad fundamentals when it comes to New York's policy, of course, if anything, this recent pandemic and what our responses to it have really shown the differences in state government as well.
You just mentioned something, and I just talked with Judge Jeanine Pirro about this earlier. And we talked about the flight of people from Midtown Manhattan, or just generally Manhattan, to places like Westchester and Long Island in New York. And there is an exodus. And it's about 500,000 people right now. And apartments are being not able to be rented. Rates for rents have now dropped 50%. And people say that hasn't hit the bottom yet. We're seeing that also in cities like San Francisco, California, where you have a mass exodus as well. That was starting to happen before the pandemic. You have obviously quality of life issues. You have homelessness, drugs. You have literally people, defecating on the streets. We take a look at that, and then we take a look at people like de Blasio in New York, mayor, and we take a look at mayors like Breed in San Francisco. or in Los Angeles. Why do these politicians not get it, do you think? Why do they not understand that raising, and I know this is one of your barometers that you look at in your test, minimum wage requirements makes businesses, franchises, whoever it may be, realize that they can't compete and they have to leave? What is it about this brand of politician today, do you think, Jonathan, whereby they just ignore the facts and the data, and it seems to me that they are just, putting their philosophical fingers on the scale?
Yeah, boy, that's a big question. And you look at some of these cities, like I mentioned, I was from Michigan. Detroit's been governed by one political philosophy for 100 plus years. And it seems like, why isn't that Detroit has figured out the mistakes of the past and really helped to turn the corner? That's a big unanswered question, I know. And bankruptcy, even recently in Detroit, didn't seem to alter the trajectory of that city in a meaningful way. I think, you mentioned it though, these are politicians in the governed cities, right? That's what happens. They have to run to get elected. I think the constituent base in many of the cities is very progressive left, and they probably have to make promises to get elected to the progressive left, such as things that are maybe good politics for them, such as minimum wage laws at $15 an hour is being proposed in many cases, even on the statewide ballot in some states, as we've seen in recent years, on the statewide ballot in Florida, for instance, this fall. But something like that, while it's great politics in many cases, especially in progressive city political scenes, it's horrible economics, as we know. And unfortunately, people don't get elected for policy ideas in many cases. And I think that's just an unfortunate reality of where we're at, is that people get elected because of their political skills, and they look at the polling and they look at their focus groups and they have their political advisors tell them, well, the minimum wage is a winning issue. And then it's one of these things where short-term gain politically, long-term cost economically, the seen versus the unseen, as the great Thomas Sowell would say. And it's unfortunate that people don't put the pieces together in many cases to say, why is it that we have problems creating jobs in our cities or our state when we get a minimum wage law too high, or we get a tax rate too high? And unfortunately, people like to demagogue the issue and go after businesses as some sort of a robber baron type that is out to exploit people, versus they're the people who are actually helping communities, giving back to communities in many cases, and employing people within the communities. I think that's a very different philosophy of governance that you see kind of in the progressive left-wing cities versus many other parts of America that take a much different approach.
It's part of what you guys are doing right now is you're not just taking a look from a metric standpoint, which is always looking in the rearview mirror. You have to use data that has been accumulated over a period of time to project forward, but you're also looking forward as well. I find this very interesting because you guys have an economic outlook. And so, the outlook, I guess, is taking information. Best predictor of future behaviors is past behaviors, correct? And you're using that information to allow your readers to understand the trends of these different states. And I find it very interesting that for the past, you've got something that goes back 12 years, from 2008 to 2020, and you see the state rank trends. And you see the states like California, which has vacillated at the bottom between 46, 47, 48 for the past 12 years. So this is nothing new for California. It's been a downward trajectory for the past 40 years. But you see states like, Idaho, which has dramatically moved up the rankings. I think you have it at number 3 this year. Talk about the differences between states like California and tiny little Idaho. What did Idaho do, and other states like that, to project them up in the rankings?
Well, I can tell you, after talking to quite a few of our state legislative members out in Idaho, is there's a lot of former Californians that are now Idaho taxpayers living in various parts of the state because of this difference, right? Especially as people get into retirement age and they see the cost of living is on a fixed income in California versus going someplace else. And there's some beautiful parts of Idaho and places like Utah and others that you talk about that you can stay in the West. but you can be near family and an easy flight back to California, but take advantage of much lower costs of living and a much greater quality of life. And I think that's what we've seen is those states have generally taken the approach of not overextending themselves when it comes to spending, because at the end of the day, Dave, in Washington here, we don't even talk about balancing budgets anymore. We just crossed the precipice of $27 trillion of national debt. But at the state level, 49 out of the 50 states actually have balanced budget amendments, right? And so states must decide, live between, within their means, but also balance spending and taxes, because they're really the same discussion at the state level. And so I think one of the themes that we've seen in the states that have been able to stay competitive and move up in the rankings is while California continues to add debt and spend more and tax more, and even proposals now in recent weeks that would go after people who have left California with a wealth tax for up to 10 years after leaving California. I think they've realized that this out-migration effect has a horrible impact on California revenues, and they've really kind of hit the Laffer curve, so to speak, when it comes to hitting tax rates at the highest in the country. Many of these other states out in the West that are in the top of our ranking have moved up, and sometimes in a very gradual way, but you do it because you have prudence on the budget side, you don't overspend, and then over time, as the economy grows, you're able to reduce taxes and reduce regulations. And you look at that Western tier of states, almost all of them are right to work states, and they're very competitive to business investment and individuals. So I think across the board, there's lots of great stories, Utah being one of them. I mean, it's been number one for all 13 editions of Rich States, Poor States for Economic Outlook, for instance.
Yeah, you've got Utah at number one going back the last 12, 13 years. It's incredible. And it's funny because right below that, you see the state of Vermont. They've been number 49 or 50 for the past 12, 13 years. And so, the state of Bernie Sanders and Ben and Jerry's, you are ranking as one of the worst states to live and do business in consistently. And so why do you think, I guess I'm asking you for a personal opinion on this, why do you think people like Bernie Sanders and those that are promulgating policy in states like Vermont, when you see that they are at the very, very dead bottom consistently, still continue to be reelected?
That's a really good question. I think that in some cases they're proud of the idea that they're anti-business, right? And I think they think in many cases they can get by as a state, perhaps by being anti-business, especially in the short term. I mean, when the chickens come home to roost, though, unfortunately, what you have is huge outmigration, huge loss of economic opportunity. And then even for those who are kind of that progressive mindset of the Bernie Sanders type, all of a sudden then you see your revenue base go away to other states. And that's when it really hits home. And when it comes to roost, as I said, is, you have deteriorating revenue growth because you've lost your tax base, you've lost taxpayers going to other states. And then all of a sudden you have to raise taxes on the remaining businesses and individuals and become even more uncompetitive. And now it's gotten to a place in Vermont, for instance, Dave, that they've actually thought about proposals of trying to pay people in order to come to Vermont or to stay in Vermont, because otherwise the dynamics are not in a way that is going to be conducive for Vermont to grow.
Universal basic income. Yeah, and they're trying that in certain states right now. Certain cities like Stockton, California have implemented that as well. Before I talk about upcoming events such as our election with you, I just want to ask specifically regarding certain states that we've seen that as they politically become more, you take a state like Georgia that has historically been very red, and now people are suggesting that it is becoming very purplish, especially in places like Atlanta. And at the same time, you're seeing their rankings going down in your metrics. Do we have a situation right now where there is I guess states like Georgia can change? Texas, Democrats are campaigning very hard right now in Texas. They think it may be gettable. I think that may be a reach for them. But what are you seeing as trends where former conservative-leaning states are now migrating more bluish, if you will?
Yeah, there's a lot of battleground states that fall into that purple area these days in terms of their political color, at least. You look at a state like Georgia, like you mentioned, that has unfortunately fallen in rich states, poor states economic outlook rankings to some degree because they have fallen behind by standing still. That's one of the great lessons I think we've learned over this number of years is as states become more competitive all the time and look for ways to be competitive, at least especially the leaders.
Yeah.
But you've got states like North Carolina that have moved up tremendously, being middle of the pack in the mid-20s back just a decade ago, now in the top 5 for economic outlook because of Governor Pat McCrory, former governor, and a very free market legislature that really, I think, did what we consider the gold standard of tax reform in a purple state that has now gotten their corporate rate, which is pretty envious to many states and businesses and states, down to 2.5% statewide as their business tax rate. And they went to a flat tax. They've done a lot of the things that we've pointed out would be very positive for economic growth. And North Carolina continues to see in-migration. In fact, they had surpluses that set themselves up very well for this COVID pandemic and the budget strain that it puts on so many state budgets this year. North Carolina had billions stocked away in rainy day fund and other things to protect taxpayers during this downturn. So I think you've got that case study on one bookend of a purple state that has done things very well. You've got Georgia that got a bit complacent, I think, a state that had done things right for a long time. But let's not forget the neighborhood that Georgia's in, so to speak, in the Southeast is actually one of the most competitive. I just mentioned North Carolina and that phenomenon, but then it's got Florida, one of the powerhouse economic growth states in America with the no income tax on personal income, low tax burdens overall. You've got Tennessee to its north where you have a no income tax state as well, a state that's been very, very competitive in our top 10 in rich states, poor states, along with Florida. And Georgia has fallen behind just by getting a bit complacent. Then you look at maybe something out west, like Colorado, a state that maybe is a bluish purple today, but a decade or two ago was pretty reliably red. Colorado's really hung in there. And this is actually, I think, one of the key policies that many lawmakers could learn from is about 25 years ago now, Colorado voters placed in its state's constitution what we call the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which limits the growth of government to the growth of the private sector economy. It's a great novel concept, right? It's something that we all practice, businesses and individuals, when we do kitchen table budgeting. Governments often neglect that, but Colorado voters had the wisdom to put that in their state constitution. And as a result, even as Colorado has transitioned, and probably there's some in the legislature that would love to raise taxes, they're constrained by this constitutional protection. So lots of different ways that purple states have governed. You look at Texas, maybe it's the big question mark as to what happens there politically, and whether we see shifts in lots of, let's say, Californians that have moved into Texas. Do they bring their voting behavior with them? That's one of the biggest question marks, I think, from a lot of our folks that we talk to in Texas. One of the things that Texas just did, though, was overwhelmingly placed a constitutional protection to ensure that Texas would never have a personal income tax. And so they've taken some additional steps to add and really bake in some of those important policy levers that have kept Texas competitive, just like constitutionally Colorado stayed competitive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Joe Rogan's show, but he just moved from California to Texas. He lives in Austin now, and he says he wants to bring in local policymakers to plead with them not to allow Californians that are moving in, because they're surrounded now by Californians. One of my best friends moved to Dallas this year from California, and he's pleading with them not to allow Californian voting habits to infiltrate Texas. And this is a liberal guy. I mean, Joe Rogan, I guess he's more libertarian leaning than liberal, but he said he was going to vote for Bernie. So they see it for what it is. But it's interesting because you talk about Colorado, and just 10 years ago, you had Colorado ranked second in the nation, the top second in the nation for 2 years in a row. Now, as it leans more blue, there's a Senate seat up for grabs in less than a month from now, and that could flip. And now you have it at 18. I find it interesting that you have other states like Indiana that 10 years ago was 17 and 20. As it's moved more red, you now have it number 3 and 4 the last couple of years. So there definitely is a relational shift to the politics of the state, isn't there?
Yeah, and this is really interesting in how some states have transitioned so quickly when it comes to the policy environment. And I think that's it should give everyone hope is that, regardless of how uncompetitive your state is today, in a relatively short amount of time, you can really change the growth trajectory of your state. I mean, I'm a Michigan native, as I mentioned. We were in a single state recession for a decade. In the past decade, we were double-digit unemployment nearly for the entire decade. There were so many people that had lost hope in Michigan, and yet Michigan turned the corner. We elected different leadership, as you mentioned. Sometimes it takes different points of view and different leaders to come in. And our new legislature, and then at the time, Governor Rick Snyder, who was Gateway Computer CEO, a lot of people remember him from those days, and Michigan became a right-to-work state. I never thought in my lifetime I would see the birthplace of the UAW become a right-to-work state, but they realized they needed to do something differently because of decades of unfortunate mistakes and outmigration, the loss of jobs, between tax cuts and right to work and different ways to reinvent Michigan. I think the positive story here is that if Michigan can turn it around, any state can turn it around after the decades that we had leading up to this last kind of revival of economic prosperity in a state like Michigan. You mentioned Indiana. Mike Pence was a big reason for that. He was very instrumental in passing a sound, balanced budget amendment into the Indiana Constitution with our ALEC members in the legislature. They also have really dramatically reduced tax burdens on individuals and businesses and looked at property taxes, something that really I know is an issue that sticks in the craw of a lot of Americans out there getting those property tax bills in the mail. There's so many important examples of states that are getting it right.
Let's talk about outlook. We are heading into the, I don't know if it's going to be the culmination of the election. I don't think we're going to know on November 3rd or 4th who won, but obviously one of the most contentious, divided political times of our lives. I say that this is a binary choice election. Whatever your opinions are of the personalities of the candidates, it is the philosophy and the policy that will be implemented that will impact specific states across the country, not just on a federal level, but on a statewide level as well. That binary choice is one of two directions that the country can go down. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, what happens at the federal level has direct impact at the state level, right? So all the things we've been talking about are directly impacted, let's say, through tax reform. That was one of the big things that, we had in the last couple of years, the first federal rewrite of the tax code in 31 long years that President Trump signed into law. And it immediately it impacted nearly every different state tax codes that states have to react to those decisions. And so absolutely, it's a huge difference in kind of choice of direction that we want to head as Americans. And, you're right. And, while I have my personal, views, the organization doesn't get involved in politics, but, you're right. There's a big difference in philosophy at the top of the ticket. And of course, that will translate into some big decisions for state and local units of government to navigate as well.
How will states that are relatively red today, that are at the top of your economic index, fare under, I guess, I don't know if it's going to be a restriction on 10th Amendment where you have more, federal power coming in, mandating certain issues. I see that happening right now if a Biden administration wins as opposed to a Trump reelection. How would a Biden administration impact those states at the top of your index, do you think?
Well, there's a couple of issues that revolve around that. And I think, it could be, taking what we've seen out of, let's say, the U.S. House under Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her progressive kind of style of government coming there. And, they've advocated one of the big things that's been a sticking point in recent negotiations, as has been this idea of should the federal government come in and really bail out states and take more control over state governing decisions. And that's something that might be a little counterintuitive for people to think through. But we've said, hey, wait a minute, this is a horrible policy idea, because guess what? The states that have done things right and have done the heavy lifting to balance their own budgets and keep their economies competitive competitive. The states that you mentioned at the top of our economic outlook ranking are going to be adversely affected by this because their taxpayers are going to be the ones bailing out the failed systems in Illinois, in California, in New Jersey, in New York that have had decades worth of mismanagement of their pension systems and debts and unpaid bills, and they haven't taken the difficult moves. As somebody who spent a lot of time in those state capitals of the states I just mentioned, in those high tax states, I can tell you among the governing political class in those states, there is this either implicit or maybe explicit in some cases sense that they feel if they get the right set of characters elected in Washington, D.C., they don't have to take care of their problems because Uncle Sam is going to print the money, borrow from China, or just come through and bail out those bad decisions. And guess what? It's not going to be their taxpayers by a large sense. It's going to be socialize those costs out into taxpayers across America. So that, unfortunately, is a huge dynamic. And I do think that you have a kind of the left-wing approach to how to handle this situation is bailing out cities and states. What does that mean longer term? It means this erosion of the 10th Amendment, as you said. It's the erosion of this quintessential American principle of federalism, that we think states should govern themselves, and that when we see a dollar come from Washington, we should know that there are strings, or if not chains, maybe attached to those dollars with restrictions on states, with really more federal requirements coming to states. We saw it in the bailout of states during the Obama administration, where now states were stuck with these things such as maintenance of effort requirements, that even as the federal dollars dried up, states were tied, their hands were tied by federal requirements going forward. And let me just leave you with this to prove the point of how damaging it is long-term for states. Outside of the federal bailout of states in the Obama years, when now that we had the data to look at it, we found, and with one of our economist friends at Portland State University, Eric Fruits, in a study that he did, found that more than of every dollar that went to states from the federal government, states then had to raise their own taxes and fees by more than 80 cents on the dollar because the federal dollars dried up, the requirements and the regulations stayed, and then states wanted to, in many cases, keep those programs, but had to pay the full cost themselves. And that led to huge tax and fee increases, unfortunately. So we think it's bad for the fiscal situation nationally because in an era of $27 trillion of national debt, can we be affording to bail out anyone? I think we need to get our fiscal house in order nationally first. And then for those of us who care about state autonomy and competition amongst states and federalism, this is one of the worst approaches. And I think that's is one of the big flashpoints, not only the congressional negotiations right now, but based on who is the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in future years. Is it going to be that approach, or is it going to be allowing states to govern themselves?
You are an economist. You're the chief economist and executive vice president at ALEC. I have to ask you this from, just as a broad approach. I would have expected at 27 trillion, I called this when we hit 16 trillion, that we were going to see massive inflation. We were going to see corrective measures because you can't have this amount of your GDP. Right now we're at 95% just to pay the interest and take care of this debt. I'm surprised that we haven't seen some kind of cataclysmic, a correction in our economy yet. I guess this would be one of our last questions here for you, Jonathan. Is there an impending correction coming? If so, yes, what does it look like? And if not, then does a national debt even matter?
Well, I think, let me take the second part of that first, is absolutely the debt matters. And it's difficult to talk about during a year like this with the pandemic and so many different requests out for federal support and so many areas that are hurting, right, across the country. But I do think it's important for us to not take our eye off that larger question in the big picture here, as we've seen our national debt really soar in recent years. I was going back and looking at my research, looking at the bailout of states there in the Obama era, and I guess it was our national debt was something like just over $10 trillion at that point during the start of this new business cycle that we're in today. And, that is an astronomical pace of growth for the debt over a very short period of time.
Yeah, it doubled in 8 years under Obama. What took 240 years to get to 10 trillion, it doubled in 8 under Obama. But conservatives were concerned about that, and now we're at 27.
Yes, and we should be concerned about it at both levels. I think it's much more concerning now, certainly, than it was at 10. And I do think we're pushing the limits on, what a mature global powerhouse economy like the United States can endure when it comes to that level of debt. Obviously, we've got the phenomenon of us being the world's reserve currency that is in our advantage. We're an extremely large economy. There's the idea that where else are investors going to go for stable returns in a country that believes in the rule of law and property rights. There's all of the advantages that the United States still has attracting global investment, and that certainly helps. But I do think we're pushing the limits. And I wish I had a crystal ball to say, what is it? If there's a straw that breaks the camel's back in this sense, what would it be? I just think that we're pushing the limits on this, and it's a dangerous spot to be in. And unfortunately, this is a bipartisan problem, right? We've had Republicans control Washington. We've had Democrats control Washington. And the one thing that remains constant is our spending continues to grow in an unsustainable way, and our debt just is not going down. We really lost a big opportunity. We had a 10-year recovery. It was very slow during the Obama recovery coming out of the '08 recession, as you know, slowest recovery coming out of a recession since World War II, according to Stanford economist Ed Lazier, one of my favorites. And then we got into a really nice period of growth in the recent years. And unfortunately, we did not harness that growth and use it to buy down debt. If anything, debt has grown during this period of growth. So I think we're in a very difficult spot. I don't know what that number is, but I don't want to get anywhere close to it to begin the unraveling.
Well, I said this the other day. There's a reason gold is at an all-time high right now. People are concerned about it. And we've got to watch out for this. I'm hoping that if there is a re-election of Donald Trump and we get past COVID, that this is going to be addressed, that politicians on both sides of the aisle need to figure out before we have to implement austerity measures. I don't want to see people lose their Social Security. Okay, but we've got to address this in some common sense way, because like you said, both sides of the aisle are kicking this can down the road. I'm 51. I don't expect to see Social Security at this point because it just isn't there. So it does need to be addressed. Jonathan Williams, please tell everybody where they could find more information about your good work and where they can find ALEC and everything else, please.
Yes, well, you can go to ALEC.org, that's ALEC.org, and look at all of our different studies across the economic policy spectrum, and then also richstatespoorstates.org, where you can get 13 years of our report, the rankings, and see how your state has either improved or in some cases declined, as well as a fun tool to say, if you enact a new policy, what would it do to your ranking? We allow everybody to go calculate that for themselves at richstatespoorstates.org.
And I got to tell you, it's a fascinating site. There wasn't any where I saw that there was a paywall. It's just information that everybody's able to read and learn about your state, the competitive ranking of your state. And I think that this migration, that people are voting with their feet, is definitely the story of our time right now. As I said, 8 friends have left California, and these are good people with good businesses or good jobs. And I can only imagine what the real numbers are when we take a look at it outside of the fog of politics. Jonathan, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I found that illuminating and greatly appreciate it. And we'll have to have you back on down the road.
Well, sounds great. Very much appreciate having me on the show. And thanks for everything you do, Dave.
Thanks, Jonathan. Take care. Thanks, Jonathan. I found that fascinating, and I hope you did as well. And of course, thank you again to Judge Jeanine Pirro. Let us know what you think in the comment section, whatever platform it is that you're watching this, YouTube, Ricochet, our podcast applications. Give us a 5-star rating and a comment that helps others find us as well. We're also on Spotify and Google Play, Stitcher, and all of the other podcast applications you may have in your phone. And of course, again, please subscribe to us on YouTube and comment as well. For some reason, we don't have a lot of traffic on YouTube. I know that's where most people don't watch us, but it would be nice to get some traffic there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back again next week here at Whiskey Politics. Cheers.